Hello and welcome to the audio highlights for Chapter 2. This chapter covers cultural identity development. We're going to expand upon some of the terms that we were introduced to last in Chapter 1, and we're also going to look at several identity development models across a few different variables of multiculturalism. So let's get started. First of all, we have a more developed definition of culture than you may have seen before. So Gladding defines culture as a set of values, beliefs, expectations, worldviews, symbols, and appropriate behaviors of a group that provides its members with norms, plans, and rules for social living. So in short, culture is a way of being that lets people know what to expect and kind of keeps people within certain boundaries of expectations and how to behave in different circumstances. So sometimes culture is looked at in terms of a static identity, like a box that we check or just a label that we identify with. And actually, culture, as we're going to learn in this chapter, is more like a verb. It's an ongoing process in identity development. So culture is something that you can sometimes observe on the outside, like examples of symbols or art or literature that are representative of a group, but sometimes cultural identity is happening internally within people, and it's part of beliefs and thoughts and values that a group shares. So I want you to look at it in terms of an ongoing process rather than a static kind of set way of being. This chapter also further defines race. One of the most important things that I hope you'll take from this chapter is that race is definitely not a box that we check or even based on our skin tone. Race is actually a political and a socioeconomic construct. So it's not something that I can simply look at somebody and determine what their race may be. It's not even necessarily something that an individual can tell me what their race may be. It has to do with a number of different variables that some have to do with kind of these artificial categories that we assign to physical appearance, like skin color, but also it has to do with political things that are at work in our nation and in our world and have been across time, as well as different socioeconomic experiences that people of different races have. So please recognize that race is much more complicated or much more complex than just a box to check. And again, this chapter does a good deal of work describing different racial identity models. So again, that multi-stage process that's ongoing often across a person's lifespan that has to do with how they find meaning in their racial identity and how one integrates that into their sense of self. Ethnicity is also defined, and make sure that you understand that ethnicity and race are not the same thing. So ethnicity is another group classification that an individual may kind of identify membership with a group of people because they share a common origin and a unique social and cultural heritage. So, for example, an individual from Haiti may not identify with the term African American because they may not feel that their roots are or that their ethnicity is well represented in with the term African American. So while they may identify with the race of being black and the identity of being black, their ethnicity may be quite different than an individual who does identify as having kind of origins and roots in Africa. So there are many examples of this, and for me, examples help me understand these different terms much better than just reading the terms, but it is important to get the definitions under your belt as well. Another important one is orthogonal cultural identity, which just means that most of the time people have multiple coexisting identities. So we can't just ask someone, oh, what is your race? That doesn't begin to get to a person's racial identity and their process of developing that. And just two last terms before I preview kind of the identity development models. We have two terms, enculturation and acculturation or acculturation. So enculturation is just a process in which through different interactions with people that are raising us and friends and adults around us, we learn these different cultural and even psychological qualities of our group. So it's almost the way that we're taught our culture. And then acculturation or acculturation is when we change our different behaviors or thoughts or values or beliefs, especially as a minority group, to maybe be more in line or more like the dominant culture. So sometimes members of minority groups are saddened by acculturation because they believe that when members of their minority group kind of adopt these overarching dominant ways of life, that their ways of living and their heritage and history are kind of lost. So sometimes acculturation can be a sad thing for some members of minority groups. Okay, so the next several slides and many pages of this chapter that I want you to spend some time reading and perhaps making tables to compare the different stages so that you can really get a more cohesive view of these models and what they have in common and how they are different. But these next several slides go through different racial and ethnic identity development models. So we go through that this is really a framework that you're going to want to use. Not necessarily, of course, we would never diagnose people on certain stages or that they haven't made it past this stage, but it's a good start to understand kind of the patterns of responses and the ways that we integrate race and ethnicity into our identity as people. So as you go through, there are different models by different theorists. This is Helms' People of Color Identity Model. One thing I want you to note when you study these models is that it's not necessarily true that people will go through every stage. Some people may become somewhat stuck in a stage. Some people may never go on to another stage. So these stages are presented as kind of a continuum in terms of how many people develop their identity, but they're not intended to be a guiding path that everyone starts at this point and ends at before death. It's just not the case. Another thing I wanted to point out was Helms also was one of the first theorists to develop a white racial identity model. Helms took issue with the fact that we were developing identity models for minority populations, but an identity model hadn't been developed yet for what it's like to develop an identity as a white, specifically a white American. So as we come to terms with race and what it means to identify as a group, as a majority group member or a dominant group member, part of that identity development comes with awareness to some of the disheartening and very sad oppressive things that the white race has perpetuated on minority groups and minority members. So Helms identified the fact that if we don't believe that the white race should be kind of the default or even the norm, then we also need to look at what it's like to develop an identity as a white individual or as a white American. So Helms laid out the stages with that, and then also talked about, again, it's not guaranteed that anyone will go through all of these stages from start to finish, or they may even sometimes circle back to some other stages. So this was another contribution by Helms, which was a major contributor to the theory around racial identity. So there are a number of other theories related to racial identity development, including biracial identity development and multiracial identity development. So keeping in mind that this can be more complex than just the identity of one race. And then our chapter moves to gender and sexual identity development. So these theorists borrowed the same idea in terms of different stages that one may or may not go through all of them, but that they may adopt to move through kind of different stages of responding to the biological, psychological, and social influences related to one's gender or sexual identity development. So I had mentioned that tables might be helpful to look at differences and similarities, and here's one that our slides actually provided for us. This is a comparison of the Downing and Rausch model to the Hoffman model, and both of these are models of feminist identity. So you can see that there's differences in the way that the stages are labeled, and then there's also obviously differences in the number of stages, but it's important to see how these are kind of building to our knowledge of cultural identity. So don't look at it in terms of one being better than the other, one being more accurate than the other, rather kind of different views and different perspectives and how people might traverse the long journey in the path of developing one's identity in gender or sexual orientation, which is the next section of theories that our chapter goes over. So again, just emphasizing that sexual identity, like race and ethnicity and gender, it's an ongoing, continuous process that we're continually kind of working through self-acceptance and many times in the case of sexual identity, disclosure of that. So it's not, unlike race, one's sexual identity is not visible. So it's a choice that we need to disclose or not disclose, and sometimes that choice varies in different environments. And then how do we integrate all of this? We don't want to be this kind of these puzzle pieces laying across the floor. We want all of these pieces together to form a cohesive self. And that's ideal for psychosocial development and also ideal for our society. Okay, so our text moves through some different models of sexual identity, including models of bisexual identity. And I want you to go through those and read those, and again, understanding the differences between them and also the similarities that they contribute. And then last, our chapter finishes up with spiritual and faith identity development. So this one is unique because an individual may come to you and may not even mention their spiritual identity. So this may be one that, if appropriate, and often it is because you'd like to know the whole being that you're working with as a human services or a counseling professional, you're going to want to ask appropriate and respectful questions about what part does spirituality play in this person's identity. And this one can be a really difficult one to hold back our own values in terms of, it's okay if you have your own spiritual beliefs, they may or may not align with the individual that you're working with. So how do you kind of hold back your values from imposing? It would never be appropriate in a counseling relationship to impose your religious beliefs or views on your client. So, but it would be appropriate to have a dialogue about the client's views and how they impact their life and their identity. So it can be tricky to walk that ground, but one of the best ways to prepare for those conversations is to develop a really strong sense of self-awareness of your own spiritual and religious development. So it's really important that you understand your history with spiritual development and these other identity development pieces we've talked about in this chapter, and that you can also continue to consult and seek supervision. Is I'm sure you will see that repeated throughout our course in terms of that one of the best ways to fend off the pitfall of imposing your values is just to make sure that you're constantly checking in with other professionals and you're consulting. So maybe a client comes to you and has a spiritual identity or a religion that you've never heard of or that you know very little about. So that would be a great time to seek some consultation with somebody who does have expertise in that area or who has more experience than you. So I know this is a text-heavy chapter. There's lots of models and theories and stages to learn about. But I think one of the best ways to kind of summarize your study of this chapter is to really review the case studies in your chapter. They're great applications of the material, so they get us away from just the stages and the definitions, and they actually apply it to stories. They're hypothetical stories, but they're great examples that once you start to read these case studies, I'm betting that you're going to be able to pull up things from your own life and your own history to think about, well, wow, I remember this happening, or maybe even a current event, and apply it to where you think it fits within these different models of cultural identity, or the other terms that we've learned already this term. So I really encourage you to do the case studies within this chapter, chapter 2, and I hope these audio highlights were helpful.